天音美沙がエルを知っているかもしれないという報告をしてきたんだ。これによると天音はエルに調べられたということになるが、問題はここからだ。以上のことから天音はキラを
Whoa, look at that. Oh. Is that our Kara right there? I think that's our Kara. Spiky hair guy.
エルの正体を暴くのが契約だったはずだ。
コイルにもこの席についてもらうべきでは。それはそうだな。
It's him, isn't it? Yeah, that's him.
会議が終わっても家に帰れば犯罪者。
Right, they showed this person's home.
キラは忙しい。
Ah, it is him. Okay, confirmation. Yeah, it was starting to become clear in the last episode as well.
天音美沙は第二のキラだったに違いない。そして
Okay.
エルに捕まった。そこから逃れたということは、ノートの所有権を放棄し、
Whoa.
なくしたと。
Whoa.
これを放っておく手はない。私は天音美沙を妻に迎える。
Ram's not gonna like that.
金、地、そして美しい妻。傍から見れば羨ましい限りだろう。結婚したら保険金をたんまりかけてやる。
Yeah, I was gonna say she's gonna bring up the whole disgusting aspect again. It's actually really nice to see Rem again. All I need now is Ryuk.
今私がミサのためにしてやれることはこれくらいしか。
Oh.
あなたはキラに会いに行くと言って東京に出てきた。
ミサさん、そこは臭くと言っても
I love this.
やめてください。
今の白人の演技っていうのに。
いいからやり直しです。
The piece of the Death Note, is she going to...
真面目にやっていただかないと蹴り入れますよ。
ミサミサ。
Zoro.
笑ってないって。ミサでいいからモチ。
モチ。
見てない。しかし、これもキラを
He might get lost. Careful now.
ミサミサ。
何モチ。
ミサミサファイタ
ー。やるときはやるのねモチ。
祝賀会の用意をしてお待ちしております。
Right, they can't use Matsuya anymore, right? Matsuda.
その犯人を殺したキラを尊敬している。そしてあなたはキラに会いに行くといい東京に出てきた。
Practice this.
そんなこと誰に。
しかしこれは確かな情報なんです。
Look at his hair in the
ミサ
frame.
さんの顔にもバレたと書いてある。
コイル。
The guy.
そこまで操作していると。
でも私は第二のキラじゃないし、キラと何の関係もないと分かったから今こうしているんです。
Rem's back on the scene though, and she's got that paper Death Note piece.
目隠しされていたので頑張らなきゃ。
Is he gonna come in here? Oh, she's gonna see. Just like the bus.
こんな切れ端に触れさせても失った記憶
Right,
が戻らない。
but she can see her now
しかし
though.
これでミサは私
Just like the guy on the bus, the robber.
を見ることができる。
He can see Ryuk.
何これ。お化け。
私はミサの味方だ。
私の味方。
ミサミサ
She's taking it.
やっぱり盗聴器ぐらいつけるべきだったんじゃ。
僕が監禁される前のキラと今のキラ、明らかに違う。今の
Oh.
キラは殺人を犯し報道されたものを片っ端から裁いているが、前のキラは殺意のなかったもの、誤って人を殺してしまったもの。
Oh, so like
情状
accidental.
酌量の余地のあるものに対しては極力裁きを下していない。
So,
キラならこういう裁きをするだろう。
and there's a clear difference there,
前
right?
のキラの裁きの基準、僕の考えに恐ろしく近い。
Yeah.
ヤガミライトはキラだ。ライトは今何をしている。私は死神だ。お前は一度私と
So this is it.
言ってること全然わからない。ミサと会ったライトがキラって。
そのノートでヤガミライトは犯罪者を裁いている。
Okay, so here's
キラと呼ばれる存在になった。そしてミサもキラと同じ、いやそれ以上の力を持っている。
Shinigami eyes.
その力でミサはキラであるヤガミライトに近づくことに成功した。
ライトがキラでミサが第二のキラ。
It's happening, man.
いや、そうだったが正しい。しかしこの状況はすべてライトの作戦通りのはずだ。
龍崎当たってんじゃん。死神さん、あなた本物だね。
She's so accepting of this.
のこと全部わかって。
Yeah, I mean, again, yeah, she is telling her.
信じるよ。
Yeah.
愛してるよ。死ぬほど。それにライトがキラで、ミサもキラで、二人でキラ
It's really awesome. Again, that could just be the translation.
信じる。
そのライトへの気持ちも一生変わらないだろう。ならば私ももうミサの幸せはライトについていき尽くすことだと考える。これから面接に戻ればミサには誰がキラなのかわかるはずだ。こいつは特に信用する。
トイレ長くなっちゃってすみません。
So now she'll be able to see Rem.
ミサが戻った時、私の前に座っている男がキラだ。
樋口がキラ。
Higuchi.
最悪。疲れたっと。
どうでした？
四つ葉はミサさんの各方面での広告採用を決めました。
そうですか。それはよかった。
Look at his dad in the background.
メールアド教えたら、あの7人のうちの3人がもうプライベートな誘いをしてきたよ。
なんだと？
この誘いに乗っていって送っていけばいいのね。
タレントとしてだけ動くんだ。
ライトがそうしろって言うならそうする。
Oh, he noticed.
じゃあミサ、疲れたし、明日のロケ
He noticed that little change, right?
ライト、一緒に寝ない？
何言ってるんだミサ。
Chief Yagami's just sitting right there.
それはキラを捕まえてからね。照れなくていいよ、ライト。
照れなくていいです、ライト君。僕は照れてない。
伊沢さん、お疲れ。
ここの電話を借りればいいんだよね。
Can't get over it.
じゃあちょっと待っててね。
ちょっと待って。
先輩、お疲れ様です。
先輩。
ノリちゃん、ナース服似合ってる。
Oh, okay. Bit of a switcheroo?
うまくいった。
This creeper.
それよりナース服とはいいね、ミサちゃん。
お気に召しました？
Yeah, he likes it all right.
デートです。樋口京介。
Higuchi.
この間接待した時以来、一番しつこく誘いのメールを送ってきたスケベ
Ah, okay, yeah. He is a creeper, isn't he?
キラだったなんて。
Rem in the backseat.
何を考えているんだミサ。これは八神ライトの言う通りの行動なのか。
Not quite, but
ミサはいざとなったら私に樋口を殺してくれと言っているだけか。
だってミサは第二のキラだから。
まさかこの子が過去に第二のキラだったとしても今もなんてないよな。記憶もなくしているはず。どういうことだ。
That's interesting though that he knows that much at least.
大丈夫だよ。俺はこれで結構紳士だ。
Yeah, I'm sure you are.
ミサもキラにしか第二のキラの証拠見せる気ないし。
どういう意味？
ミサ、キラのお嫁さんになるのが夢なの。キラも絶対ミサを必要としてるから。
第二のキラなら桜テレビの事件から真闇の目を持っているのが明らかだ。
Misa.
もしこれが本当ならこの子は何としても俺のそばに置いておきたい。じゃあ殺してみろよ。俺はキラかもしれないよ。
いいよ。でも悪い人しか殺さないよ。
そうだな。悪い人か。ひどい取り立てで有名で場合によっては保険金で払わせ
I mean, Rem's gonna have to step in then, right? Because she doesn't have the death note.
死んだかどうかすぐ確かめられる？
ミサ、私が金星銀座を殺すんだな。それで樋口を信用させる。
But
四つ葉の樋口だ。
今社長が倒れて息が後にしてくれ。
Oh, whoa. Gone Higuchi.
決まりだ。
Oh.
で、俺がキラなら結婚するんだな。キラだから。
じゃあ証拠。
俺は家に帰らないと殺せない。
ああ、それじゃダメね。 ミサを樋口さんの家に連れ込む魂胆かもしれないし。じゃあ逆に犯罪者裁くの止めてみてよ。キラなら止められるはずでしょ。で、ミサが裁き始めてって言ったら裁くの。それなら信じるよ。犯罪者裁きだけはキラの意志でしか動かないはずだもん。
Oh, she's got something in the pocket.
明暗だな。
俺はキラだから。
There it is.
してもらうために今から犯罪者裁きを止める。
Yeah, just spell it out, bro.
俺がキラだと分かってもらえたら結婚だ。
Dude just gave it right off.
これでキラの正体が分かり、局長が一番気にしていた殺人も止まる。
Ah, damn. Right then, look at that. Misa has just acquired and presented the confession to top all confessions, right? Higuchi gave it up in a nice little package. I mean, the dude was essentially giving an official statement, right? I'm Kira, so in order to make you trust me, I'm going to stop killing criminals right now. I mean, it was a bit on the nose, right? Nothing about that was subtle at all. But let's move on, right? At the end of the day, it's a pretty airtight confession. But Elle's reaction to this is quite interesting, isn't it? Even earlier in the episode, as Misa returned from the Yotsuba offices, right? He instantly clocked the shift in Misa's attitude or demeanor towards Light, right? She immediately gives in and says, "I'll listen to you. I'll do anything you want me to do, or I'll do anything you say," right? Something along those lines. And Elle picked up on this instantly, as expected of Elle, right? And at the end of the episode, she just turns up and has this confession from the current Kira, right? So at this point, he has to be thinking about how such a dramatic shift might have happened, right? Or might have been possible. Surely he'll surmise that Misa has now gained back some of that knowledge, right? Or is starting to remember things. And that this has happened after she came back from the Yotsuba HQ or the building or the offices, right? After this interview. And of course, the missing piece of the puzzle being the Shinigami Rem, right? And her protective nature from Misa kicking in. More on that in a bit. But, surely Elle and Light are going to ask Misa how she managed such a thing, right? And this is substantial. This is substantial. Elle cannot overlook this at all. So things become really fascinating because of this, right? Because now Misa knows that indeed Light was the OG Kira, right? And that this has been part of, Light's grand plan. Rem confirmed that to her in the washroom, right? So Misa knows all of this now. Though it appears that touching her with a piece of the Death Note was something Rem decided to do on her own, in the moment. Also, more on that later. I have some digging to do. I think there's some shenanigans going on here. But yeah, let's put a pin in that. I'll return to that. But again, going back to the point, I feel like this is something she might have, done on her own. And it might not have been part of the plan. I mean, it couldn't have been part of the plan because she kind of did it in the moment, didn't she? Again, that protective nature kicked in, right? After hearing Higuchi's plans from Misa, right? And Rem is absolutely disgusted by this man, right? She cannot imagine Misa with this man. So she kind of did something on the spot, right? And she ripped out that piece from that Death Note. Like I said, more on that later. And ultimately, Rem was able to assist Misa in that car, right? In Higuchi's car. She played a part in assisting Misa in getting that confession out of Higuchi, right? And, gaining his trust. And in that sense, you really get to see Misa kind of take the spotlight in this episode, right? She might not be, as intelligent as Light and Elle, but she's certainly clever. She's got her own set of skills. Much like how Matsuda was focused, or a focus a few episodes ago, it was Misa's turn to be in focus, to be, in the spotlight. Now, going back to Elle and Light potentially asking Misa how she managed this, she now knows Elle was right all along. I mean, she said as much in that washroom, right? So she'll clearly have to lie about how this happened. Again, no chance Elle is going to buy this or buy anything she has to say, right? So the next episode promises to be a good one, right? Certainly promises to be a intriguing one for sure. You know, because Elle just isn't going to buy anything Misa has to say at this point, right? But he is going to dig and see if he can get something, right? Through her replies, or sorry, her responses, and perhaps her mannerisms, right? Let's see. And another problem here is essentially the problem that caused Elle to separate from the rest of the task force in the last episode, right? But it appears that they all came back together in this episode, right? Or at least they came back to Elle's side, or Elle's stance on the, you know, letting things play out. Even though they are, you know, even though people like Chief Yagami might be reluctant, it appears that they kind of did join back into just one group. I think that's what it looked like. Now, the whole reason for that was because Elle thinks it's imperative, right? He believes it's imperative that they discover once and for all how Kira actually kills, right? Because otherwise the cycle is just going to continue, right? And again, that episode did a great job of, you know, showing us his thought process as he kind of plays with the food, right? And that, you know, Kira is just going to slip, or he or she is just going to continue slipping. But now you have Misa here, who has convinced new Kira, Higuchi, to stop killing, for a time at least, right? Until further notice. So that halts or puts a speed bump or stumbling block, right? In finding out how Kira kills. And, you know, again, that is Elle's main goal at this point in time. Before, you know, he's not ready to arrest them. Even though now it's down to just one person, right? Now they even know out of the 7 that it's Higuchi. He's still not, I doubt he's still down to arrest him just yet, right? Because it is going to present that same problem. He is trying to find out how he kills, how Kira kills, right? Now, of course, you know, Misa knows now at this point in time because, of course, Rem told her, and she gave her quite a bit, you know, a bit of a lesson once again. She told her about the Death Note and that Light Yagami was original Kira and he used the Death Note for justice, right? And that she also had immense power, you know, even more than Kira, right? Far greater than Kira. Again, that's Shinigami eyes. But, you know, at this point in time, Misa is not going to say anything to Elle after that moment, right? After Rem appearing to her, she's going to look out for Light, right? But now, let's get back to Light's grand plan, right? Now, you know, the question is, how did Light plan on coming across his copy of the Death Note again? Because that Light Yagami, the Kira Light Yagami, simply must have had a plan that he felt quite confident in, right? That he would retrieve his Death Note and potentially all the memories as well. And on that front, I do have to assume that he only would have put this plan into motion if he knew 100% for sure he would gain those memories back. Because, you know, the memories of that phase of him as Kira, those are key to continuing his crusade, right? So I do have to assume that that was his understanding of this. You know, that takes me back to Rem using that piece of the notebook to touch Misa so she can see her again, right? Yeah, Rem made it clear that this piece of the Death Note is not going to return her memories. Essentially, it had the same effect it had on that bus robber, right? Earlier in the series, earlier in the season. He was able to see Ryuk after picking up that note, Light dropped, right? Strategically dropped, so the robber notices it and picks it up. Now here's the intriguing bit, right? This whole time I've been under the impression that in the beginning of episode 16, in that forest, Light relinquishes ownership or forfeits ownership of Misa's Death Note, right? Now originally it belonged to the Shinigami Jealous, right? Then Rem took it to Misa, right, and presented it to her, who lets Light Yagami hold on to it, right? And then she forfeits ownership as she is in captivity, right, by Elle. Meaning ownership then goes to Light Yagami because it was in his possession, right, at the time. So Light Yagami effectively had ownership over 2 copies of the Death Note, for a time at least, right? But the point being, they show Light forfeiting ownership of the Death Note that Misa had ownership of before him. And I was able to distinguish this then and there because I know the copy Ryuk dropped in episode 1 was in English, right? You see Death Note written in English on the cover. And Ryuk even tells Light in episode 1 that he wrote the rules in English, or the explanation in English, because it's the most popular language, right, in the human world. So this copy was prepared by Ryuk, right, the one he dropped in episode 1. But the one Misa had, it was a Shinigami's copy, right, Jealous's copy. So that one didn't have, any of those rules. It wasn't prepared like Ryuk prepared the copy he dropped in episode 1. And that's how I distinguished that, okay, he's now giving up ownership of this new copy that he has ownership of now, right? Since Misa forfeited ownership. And then it cuts to that scene of Misa, right? And they show that she loses her memories instantly, right? And then it cuts back to the other scene back in the forest, and it shows Rem fly off. So, I've been assuming she flew off with that copy, but then Rem gives it to Higuchi, right? Who Light Yagami actually might have researched and handpicked for this, right? That's still up in the air, but let's put a pin in that, right? Let's see if it does turn out like that, if Light actually handpicked this individual, right, or this type of individual. I think I brought up this idea in the last few episodes, maybe. I'm not sure, but yeah, let's put a pin in that and come back to that. Let's see how that plays out. And then in this episode, she decides to rip out that piece from the Death Note, right, from that copy, the one Misa used to have. And she touches Misa with that piece, right? Yet Misa's memories did not return. She was only able to see Rem. Again, much like the robber from that bus, right, earlier in the season. So Misa used to have ownership of this Death Note, right? So why did her memories not return, right? So my initial thought was that it might be some technicality and that, maybe she needs to touch the full page or the cover, right? Or hold it in her hands, something like that, again, a technicality. So I go digging. Right, I go digging for rules from prior mid-episode information cards, right? And even the info card for this episode is actually quite an interesting one, and it comes into play. It certainly comes into play. I'll get back to that. So I go digging, right? I start looking for rules in these mid-episode cards, and I actually got a clear-cut, definitive answer to this, and I had to go all the way back to episode 10's info card, right? So that was some time ago. Now, this is really interesting, right? One page taken from the Death Note, or even a fragment, right? That's an important part. Even a fragment of the page contains the full effects of the note, right? It's right there. That's as clear-cut as it gets, right? That answers my question. Even a fragment of the page contains the full effect, right, of the Death Note. So, yeah. Things just got really interesting, didn't they? Essentially, I believe I've been bamboozled by a misdirect, and I think it's quite a good one. It is quite a good one, and also a clever cut. And I mentioned that cut earlier, and I'm talking about episode 16. But I think I've caught on now. I think, yes, I was bamboozled, and yes, that misdirect got me. But now, because of this episode and, kind of digging deeper and trying to find out some of the rules and coming across that rule from episode 10's mid-episode card, I think I've caught on now, right? That copy Rem gave to Higuchi was not the copy Misa had ownership of. Otherwise, even a fragment of that page Rem used on Misa should have had the full effects of the note, right? That rule is set in stone from episode 10's mid-episode card. Yet Misa does not gain those memories back. So if that isn't Jealous's copy of the Death Note, then there's only one other copy of the Death Note, right? Light's copy of it from Ryuk, the one that has English on it. So then, this has to be Light's copy, right? And, that would explain why Higuchi has such a sound understanding about so many of the rules, right? He knows about the Shinigami Eyes. He knows about forfeiting ownership of the Death Note, right? And, this copy of the Death Note, the one that has English on it, the one Ryuk prepared and dropped in episode 1, it explains these types of rules, right? So it makes sense. It makes sense that Higuchi has quite an understanding of these rules. But then here's the stumbling block. Rem is the one attached to this Death Note, not Ryuk. That's quite the stumbling block, and it's quite strange, isn't it? Higuchi sees Rem. Misa sees Rem, not Ryuk. So at this point, I think the info card for this episode can shed some light on this, right? Okay, so exchanging and writing on the Death Note between the gods of death is no problem. I mean, once again, there's a direct answer to this stumbling block, isn't there? The implication being that the Shinigami might have switched their copies. That would explain why Rem is attached to this copy, right? But now there's yet another stumbling block, right? I'm going down a rabbit hole at this point. So in episode 16, in that scene in the beginning, right, in the forest, Ryuk tells Light that he never thought the Death Note he gave Light would end up in the ground, buried in the ground, right? Though of course Light corrected him and said, "I'm hiding it," right? Now, it's up in the air if Ryuk means that in the literal sense, that the specific Death Note, the one that had English on it, or just a copy of the Death Note, right? Now, going back a bit, if that is the copy that Rem has and gave to Higuchi, right? Since that copy was attached to Ryuk, Light would have to forfeit ownership of it to Ryuk, right? And then a potential exchange could happen between Rem and Ryuk, right? But Light would have to make sure that he doesn't lose his memories, right? So once again, the ownership of two copies of the Death Note at the same time comes into play here, right? So even if he gives up ownership of Ryuk's copy, the one he received in episode 1, right? The one that has English on it and the rules, he would still have his memories because he has ownership of the second Death Note. But in that scene, Light also said that as long as I have Ryuk's notebook, even if I throw away Rem's notebook, my memory of Rem doesn't disappear, right? That was a key moment. So the one that is buried, thrown away according to Light, must be Rem's copy, right? As in the one Rem gave to Misa originally, and originally came from Jealous. Because there's also a rule that states, and I came across this as well as I was going through these episodes, in search of a potential answer, the mid-episode cards of the past episodes. The God of Death must at least own one Death Note, right? That Death Note must never be lent or written on by a human. So as Rem flies off, she should have her own Death Note, and a copy she is supposed to give to the new user, right? Ends up being Higuchi. So if two copies just flew off with Rem, and I'm speaking of episode 16 again, Higuchi has one, and then they show Rem has her own copy that she writes in the back of that car, right? So that's two copies, right? Rem's own copy and the one she has to give to a new user. It means that there are two copies within the Ryuk Light Yagami duo, right? Back in that forest after Rem flew off. One copy that Ryuk simply must own, right? According to that info card. And the second one being the one that was buried, right? But then I run into another stumbling block. Light said as long as I have Ryuk's notebook. So if he has Ryuk's notebook, and the other one is buried, that leaves Ryuk without a Death Note. That goes against the info card. He must at least own one. So then, does that mean he owns the one that is buried in the ground? Because it said the God of Death must at least own one Death Note. It didn't say anything about having it on, on your person at all times, even though I'm, speaking of a Shinigami in this case. It only said that, they must own one at all times. Right, but the thing to remember about that scene in episode 16 is that in that scene, Light was actually putting things into motion, right? Trying things out to see how it plays out. He could have forfeited the ownership of Ryuk's notebook right after confirming that, yes, he still sees Rem, right? His memory of Rem is still there. Unless, of course, Light means that the only one left to him right now is Ryuk's buried copy. And he hasn't forfeited ownership, right? He tells him to get rid of it during the captivity. And then perhaps Ryuk's own copy is just on Ryuk and not part of this at all, right? That is a possibility, actually. Let's put a pin in that for now. All of that being said, the one thing I am confident about at this point is that episode 16, the opening scene in that forest, was a misdirect. And, you know, the clever cut to Misa in captivity, losing her memory, right, almost instantly, and then cutting back to Rem, Light, and Ryuk. I don't think that was a direct continuation of that scene in the forest. And, you know, this must be part of Light's elaborate plan. So I don't think I have the complete picture of how things played out in that forest. Again, you know, I think I was bamboozled. It was a great misdirect, I think. But I think I've caught on to it now. And I think, you know, they gave us a lot of things in this episode, right? Misa not getting her memories back after being touched with that piece. And, you know, that mid-episode card also plays a part, doesn't it? About Shinigami being able to exchange copies of the Death Note between them. So essentially, right now, there is one copy that is buried, right? And then there's a copy with Higuchi. And I believe the one he has is the one that has English on it. The one Ryuko initially dropped in episode 1 and Light Yagami picked up, right? The one that had instructions. He essentially prepped that, right? He prepared that copy for a human because, you know, he said that it's the most popular language in the human world. So in that sense, episode 16 does kind of answer a question, doesn't it? Light is ready to throw away Rem's notebook, right, in executing his elaborate grand plan. Because at this point in time, you know, the walls are really closing in on Higuchi, right? At this point in time, they know, you know, beyond just the 7, now they kind of pinpointed, because of Misa, the task force knows that it's this one person. So sooner or later, they'll bust him, right? They'll bust him. And since the whole task force is part of this, it's highly unlikely that Light Yagami is going to get that copy, you know, back for himself. You know, that's assuming they catch him with the Death Note. You know, it is a possibility that he could totally try to get rid of it. You know, if he starts to feel that the walls are closing in and that he is about to get busted. That's a big risk part of this plan, right? That L could finally find out about the existence of the supernatural Book of the Dead, right? The Death Note. But, you know, it's not even just that possibility. It's not just L. There's a full task force, right? What if someone else from the task force comes in contact with it, right? If they do end up busting Higuchi, right? If they do end up taking him with the Death Note in his possession. And if that major breakthrough happens, right? That major breakthrough in the story and that others do find out about the Death Note, you know, mainly L, but the task force, right? Even if it's anyone else from the task force, they don't know that they're going to see this Shinigami, right? And it is going to be Rem if they do end up touching the Death Note. So yeah, you know, that is quite an interesting possibility, isn't it? And, you know, yes, Misa knows about this, you know, because she kind of got tipped off by Rem. But, you know, Misa can't say anything to Light. She can't give him, you know, she can't tip him off about any of this. Light is attached, right? He's cuffed to L at this moment in time. So she can't really get close to Light, right? Without L noticing anything suspicious going on. So yeah, you know, this episode really set up a lot of interesting tangents, a lot of interesting possibilities, right? The walls are certainly closing in on Higuchi as the only suspect for Kira at this moment in time. But, you know, a lot of really other interesting things come out of that possibility. And, you know, the last thing I wanted to bring up was the fact that Rem has now seen an individual so disgusting that she certainly thinks Light Yagami is the much better option for Misa, right? She implores Misa to listen to Light. Also, she sees just how much Misa loves Light, right? And that nothing has really changed. You know, Rem certainly doesn't care much for Light Yagami, but she knows how much he means to Misa. And, you know, seeing Misa happy and safe is all Rem really cares about, right? But unfortunately, that is also an opening for Light, right? Unfortunately for both Rem and Misa, that Light Yagami, right? The Kira Light Yagami, before the memory loss of the Death Note and being Kira, that Light Yagami is quite manipulative. And they already showed us that, right? He essentially used Misa, right, as a tool. And he manipulated Misa into, you know, kind of getting Rem to agree to kill L, right? This is all before all of this happened, right? All before they lost their memories, and now this is the current state of affairs. So I'm sure that even back then, in that scene, you know, in that forest scene in episode 16, he was also thinking of a potential solution to this new Shinigami problem he has, right, in his life through, in the form of Rem, the Shinigami, who's certainly a problem, and he knew that even back then, that he has to somehow get rid of this problem. And the thing is, they already brought up the idea and established the possibility some time ago, right? The whole thing about how to kill Shinigami, you know, that backstory with Jealous, right? And then Misa straight up just telling Light how it's potentially done. So they established that some time ago. So I'm sure that in his grand plan, he might have thought about a potential endgame for, you know, this Shinigami problem that is Rem. So yeah, there are signs that this could be a masterstroke by Light Yagami, right? I've been saying that for a few episodes now, that he might have just put into motion some sort of insane plan, some sort of masterstroke, right? So let's see how it plays out.